In general, I like running the GPU at higher frequency. Let me show you why. This continuous improvement in AMD technology means it's dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute indicator of performance, and CU count should be avoided as well.
Well, we're finally at that point now where we've got a pretty good idea where the numbers fall in the next generation war. Yes, Sony's released the PS5 specs, and I'm sure everyone is concentrating on that teraflop count as I predicted with my video from a couple of months back. That's the point I was trying to make. But that said, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Let's be honest. They have made this machine for a very clear purpose, and that purpose is not to win headlines. That's a very different strategy that Xbox have gone after. That's not slighting the Series X. I've covered that already. It's a superb piece of kit, a great machine, and that's recently been announced and revealed by Microsoft and put all the numbers and digits out there. It was quite evident that they were playing the game to push the marketing all about their strategies. I covered this back with the PS4 Pro. In fact, my PS4 Pro video that discusses this just shows the difference between the two companies and how they're marketing and aiming their machines at the market they're going for and what they're trying to sell it as. But what do all the numbers mean? What does everything break down at? What are we talking about here? Well, obviously, before anyone jumps on it, it's quite clear. Headlines, powers, percentage, the muscle car of this generation is the Series X. That's without a shadow of a doubt. It's a 12 teraflop RDNA 2 Zen 2 powered CPU with 16 gigabytes of split pools of memory. How they work, how they operate, how they actually deliver the games and the experiences, that's the big deciding factor. And as I've already covered, it always comes down to software. But what many people will probably miss from this presentation is what Sony were really talking about. And that is that they have made a very clear step back to where they started with the PlayStation 1. The PS5 is a machine made for developers, by developers. Now that's a statement in and of itself that sounds like a cliche, but it actually isn't. You see, when you make a console like the PlayStation, it's all about getting buy-in from developers, giving them the tools to do the job, making sure they're empowered with the system, making sure they've got buy-in on the solution throughout its journey, so they feel part of the PlayStation family, and therefore they're more likely to make games on it and make the best games they can. This has always been Sony's strategy. They lost their way a little bit with the PlayStation 3. Well, totally, if we're honest. PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3 kind of went a little bit left of field. But they brought it back with the PlayStation 4. And here with the PlayStation 5, they've continued that mechanism. This was mentioned quite clearly in this presentation, which remember was aimed at the developers, not at the consumers. But it's been pushed out there because Sony need to make some presence because Microsoft are taking all that away from them. Now, this is not to say that some of it wasn't marketed to reduce the noise. The push to get the teraflops up from the original 36 core and 2 gigahertz leak, or whatever it wanted to be called on GitHub that was put out there, that clearly wasn't the original hardware though, because that version didn't include ray tracing support. It wasn't RDNA 2, and we now know it was. So it was still the target spec they were aiming for. But what is quite evident is that they clearly have a very solid and functional cooling solution, and AMD's power solution in RDNA 2 and the shift to 7nm enhanced, or whatever it's called now, in their manufacturing process has made a significant leap in how they can utilize the power in these new chips. And therefore the system on a chip, the APU that's inside the PlayStation 5, is clocked astronomically high. You know, the little joke at the beginning is just a joke, but it's realistic. 2.2 gigahertz in an APU GPU alongside a 3.5 gigahertz CPU, 8-core 16-thread. That's almighty leap forward in terms of power usage, power consumption, heat dissipation, thermal dynamics. So he alludes to the fact that there is a thermal solution in there that you'd be quite proud of. He clearly isn't lying. They must have an impeccable power cooling solution in there. Now, AMD have obviously done work there, and they've obviously used that AMD work within the chipset to try and manage and mitigate the power systems between CPUs and GPUs. I'm not going to get into that kind of detail right now. This is kind of a high-level, half an hour, 30-minute summary of coming from this presentation. So this is recorded on the evening of the presentation going out, but it's out today because I need to render it and do my daily work as well. This is part-time. So let's dive into the comparison between the two consoles and just where the strengths and sacrifices have been made on both sides. We need to be clear here, and I'll discuss this in a little bit more detail. So let's jump straight into the important part, which is the teraflop count. As I mentioned way back when I did my video last year on the discussion between how you design a console and the two options, there's the wide option and there's the fast option. And you can see that both teams have taken literally those two extremes. Microsoft have gone wide, Sony has gone fast. And as I discussed, that has an impact on cost and production yields, and that determines what your chip looks like once you stick it in the box. So Microsoft have spent a bigger part of their BOM, their bill of materials, on the chip. Sony have spent less on that, or they've had a solution that's not worked out in terms of their yield rates. Maybe they went for a 40-core chip, but it's likely a 40-core chip with 4 cores disabled, and they can't push that beyond that level. It might have been an option, but the yields aren't good enough. Next option is just clock it really high. So 2.2 gigahertz is obviously possible in the cooling system and the thermodynamics and the power gating that's used in the chip. Sony talks about the power management structure. I'm not going to go into that. I'll literally do a complete video around power usage on chips, how gating works and all that. So fundamentally, they've got enough headroom to be able to give the chip a solid power supply, and then the chip regulates its own voltage or frequency levels, which you see in PC games, see examples on screen. Look at the frequency of the GPU and the CPU. It's constantly fluctuating. That is absolutely standard. So that's the first area where they differ. Microsoft has gone with 52 cores, which is pretty wide, and obviously clocked them reasonably high, again showing just how good the power usage and thermodynamics are of the chip that AMD Solutions got. So PC gamers are in for a treat, I think, with the top of the range RDNA 2 chips. Are really going to whack it out of the park. But the point I'm stressing here and demonstrating is the fact that a GPU does not need to run and never runs at full high capacity 100% of the time. There's always peaks, there's always troughs, there's always bubbles. That's one of the reasons why async compute became so popular, trying to fill those gaps and take load away from the CPU. But this particular machine has been very heavily supplemented with additional technology. So that's not always required. But you can see on Resident Evil 2 here on the 5500 XT, the core count is jumping up and down, and even the CPU frequency can vary by around 100 megahertz, or maybe a little more. There's that variance again that you're seeing between machines. So it doesn't need to run at full capacity. No game ever does. That's just not how these things are worked. But what they've done is they've given them a consistent power supply. So within the self-regulatory, the systems within the chip, so the socket itself knows how fast it needs to run. It knows its job queue. It knows its workload, what's upcoming, what's been done. And within that cycle, it can then fluctuate the frequency up and down. The ability there on a SoC means that if the CPU drops down because it's not only using around 8 cores or it's only using 3 gigahertz, for example, on the workload, it doesn't need the rest of that power, so it can pass it over to the GPU. And now there's the confusing part that I think many people are getting confused with, and I think Sony did a quite poor job in explaining this. But again, this is for developers, so you've got to bear that in mind, but they should have really thought about how they explain this. So the boost mode isn't really a boost mode. It's actually the maximum level it gets to. Think of it as your game clock, what they talk about on, I think, AMD cards and also NVIDIA cards. So this is the standard level when it needs maximum performance. Remember, not every game is going to run at maximum performance all the time, or at least for every single part of a frame. So the polling rate you're seeing in the examples I've just shown here are actually much, much slower than it's actually fluctuating. These are just the sample rates. That's exactly how polling rates work. This means that it will fluctuate all the time throughout its life cycle, but it's under its own control. It doesn't need to worry about power, which means they can build a cooling and acoustic system that's designed around the consistent level of power it's always pushing through the system, the TDP. That means that the performance of the chip is always consistent. I would seriously doubt it's going to vary much. Maybe 50 megahertz here and there, up and down from that 2.2. So a lot of the conversation will be around the fact that that's up to 10.3 teraflops, but actually that's not the case at all. It's always going to hit that peak theoretical limit that when it needs to and how often it needs to. The same as the Xbox One X or the Series X. It's a 12.1 teraflop machine. It will not be processing 12.1 teraflops at all times. It just means that's the maximum it needs to hit when it can. The only difference here is you might have some situations where it could drop, and literally we're talking a couple of percentage here to gain back quite a significant amount of power. That's the disadvantage, which I covered before. If you overclock a machine like this, or you run the clocks higher with less cores, you run more power. It's less efficient. That's one of its impacts. Therefore, if you take back maybe 50 megahertz, you're going to gain around 10%, maybe more on the power supply. So it's very minimal. We're talking about 10.3 versus 12.1. That's the gap. It's pretty much consistent. It's not going to cause an issue at all. So the sacrifice here, quite clearly on Sony's side, is they've sacrificed the cost of the APU. The GPU portion of the chip has been sacrificed, and therefore it's cheaper and less powerful than what we're seeing on the X. But that's not to say that the X hasn't had its own sacrifices, or the Series X, because it has. And they come in two forms. Memory, which is again a little bit of a repeat of what we saw with the Xbox One, nowhere near as bad, but I'll get to that in a moment. And the big asset, and what's really impressive, and the whole system here for the PS5 has been built around the SSD. So taking an example of the last generation machines, both the standard and the Pro models, there's no difference here. We're talking somewhere between 24 times and 55 times the speed on the PS5 of the old generation. So we're talking 100 megabytes to gigabytes, 2.5, 5.5 gigabytes. That's a huge increase in performance, throughput, and therefore options for teams. I've already covered this in quite a lot of detail, so I'm not going to go over that again. But look at my other videos if you want to learn more about how that affects gameplay, transitions, and everything else. But what we're really looking at here is what this offers up to both the developers, the system, and the performance of the actual machine. Bringing me right back to my teraflop video from before. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So everything is limited by your slowest factor. That's always going to be your limit. The bottleneck is always going to be somewhere in the system, wherever that might be. So if you take away the hard drive as one of the biggest bottlenecks of modern gaming and all the times, and remember, this is in the PS5, this is an entire system, not only the SSD, but also the actual NAND flash units on the actual chip itself. The board is designed around consistent throughput, along with the Kraken decompression system that they've added in there as a hardware decompression. So they're removing all that, and on top of that, they've got a specific secondary chip to handle I/O management and the coherency cache. So they're really going all out to try and maximize every bottleneck that's going to hit the system at all times. So all of a sudden, what you're looking at is you're looking at a deficit of around 15% on the GPU, but potentially 130% improvement on throughput into the system. Not only that, but the bandwidth of the PS5 is also faster overall. You're talking about a bandwidth that's 25% faster at its best point, 10 gigabytes, and 20% slower at its slowest point on the Series X. Now, you combine those two things together, what you've got is you've got a system that has a bottleneck. It has a problem, split pools of RAM. They both have 16 gigabytes, of which 3 gigabytes are allocated to the operating system on the Series X. So 13 gigabytes, or 13.5 gigabytes it might be, are allocated to the game. The PS4 has an advantage here. And this is where, it's not been confirmed, so don't take what I'm saying as an example, but I'd be crazy if they didn't use this some way. The SSD is not only about the game, it's about the operating system. So you've got a hard drive that can cache data at the rate of 5.5 gig. If you compress it, if you manage the operating system in the way you need to handle it, and you build that into the I/O systems and the secondary chips you've got built in within your literally South Bridge, effectively, then you can transfer your entire operating system to the hard drive as a cache, and then when you need it, you can bring it straight back again. What that means is, absolute best case scenario, you can use around 15.5 gigabytes of RAM at all times, and the game uses that at all times being fed from the RAM. You can then jump straight back into the operating system by pressing the button, and within half a second, you can have 2.73 gigabytes almost pushed straight back into the RAM. That's more than the operating system is going to run. So that means you don't need to use any of your RAM anymore. You can use all of it in your cached hard drive, the same way the resume state is going to work, and we've already seen with the Series X. I'm pretty sure the PS5 will have it as well. So this means that you can transfer, all those options now go away. You don't need to sit and pack data into RAM. On top of this, the SSD means you no longer need to store all the data in your RAM package. You can just have it on the hard drive, addressable space, as I've already mentioned a few months back, and use that data to stream data in and actually allocate it to the GPU and the CPU, and allow that to address it as needed. And therefore, these two things combined gives you around 2 gigabytes more at 15.5 gigabytes, again theoretical, versus 13.5 gigabytes, along with a much, much faster SSD. Faster bandwidth overall, you're not having to manage split pools. Again, let's be clear, the Series X is not really heavily bottlenecked in that sense, in that regard. It's still faster overall, the slowest pull than the fastest on the Series X, but it's slower than the PS5. So overall, this is just other areas where bottlenecks can occur. I'm not saying they will, but they can occur within the system. This is entirely what I'm talking about at all times when I'm talking about the go back to teraflop video. This is all the things I'm trying to allude to, and I'll break down in much more detail in later videos. But what we're looking at here is a significant shift in what the machines are focused to do. Again, what I'm trying to say here is Sony have looked forward in terms of removing the biggest central bottleneck of the system, and that's come at a cost. Don't get me wrong, the Series X, when it comes to sheer compute power on a screen, i.e. resolution throughput, for example, high resolutions, the Series X is going to win all day, every day in this generation, absolutely. But we're talking 15% difference here. A quick example of here, look, Wolfenstein New Blood. This is a 6 teraflop Xbox Series X fixed at 4K and a 5 teraflop at 5500 XT fixed at 4K. Playing the game, there's a deficit. It's small, but you can see the average difference down the frame rates. You can literally bring them completely back in line, or in some cases overtake it, if you turn on the dynamic resolution scale on the 5500 XT, for example of here, if you turn it on with the Xbox One X, you can see it resolves the issues. All that's gone away. So you're now looking at an almost locked 60 FPS title, but it allows the game to scale 50%. It doesn't need a 50% scaling resolution. So the problem here is the teraflops only work if you're using them to do anything more than push resolution. Multi-platform games, that's all they're going to use it for, because you're not going to design a game around a 15% benefit on the machine. It's just not big enough. The gap between the PS4 and the Xbox One was 40%. In my opinion, I've also said this, it still wasn't a huge difference. Most of the differences between those two consoles, 90% of the time that I covered throughout the generation, right when I started, was resolution. What we're going to see now is at a much higher resolution, the gap will be even smaller, and the gap is already smaller as a percentile of what the overall performance throughput is. So you've got a machine that's 15% down on GPU power in terms of throughput, predominantly going to be used to push pixels, compared to a machine that can actually push far more around the system, use more RAM, and therefore have more options and stream data in and out of RAM as needed, and also reduce the load on the CPU to allow it to do a lot more. The compression techniques, the works, this all means that collectively there is more ability here for first-party studios and potentially third-party, but again, you're not going to push this to the limits if you've got to make it across multiple platforms and APIs. But it allows you to push your game design and your options. What we're going to see this generation on both machines is a significant shift in terms of not funneling people through channels. Go back to my Jedi or Fallen Order analysis at E3, where I talk about that more last year, but back at the E3 reveal, and then again the whole analysis I did on what optimization looks like and how RAM and allocations and bottlenecks and seek times and all that boring information. So what PlayStation 5 is a look forward in terms of 5 years time, when 7, 8, 10 gigabytes per second SSDs are available, the PS5 will start to show its age. But a machine such as the Series X that's got a 2.5 gigabyte at best, there's compressions and all that kind of stuff as well, but they both have compression techniques and they both have secondary offloaded tasks and I/O processors to handle that. It will perform much better out of the gate, and its additional teraflop usage will really come good from its first party teams if they're allowed to use it fully and not try and maximize the potential of releasing across the entire PC market. That's where its strength will be, and the early multi-platform titles. But this SSD technique, it's there on the X, but it's much better, more realized and more embedded on the PS5. It's almost a return back to the cartridge games, where your cartridge was actually in line to the system. Your cartridge was part of the RAM. It was ROM, but it was read-only memory that was accessible with the entire system. The SSD has now become a part of that. It's now supplementing the data and the GDDR6 that's on the chip. So all of these benefits means that the PS5 has potential to do more within its game design, and it could potentially, if used correctly, outperform the Series X, even though the Series X has better throughput on GPU. Collectively, it could still be bottlenecked in certain areas. Like I say, this is all very early days, but Sony have made a choice, and their choice is cost efficiency. I'm pretty sure this will end up being maybe $50, £50 cheaper than the Xbox Series X. It's not going to be a huge amount. But I think I've waffled on enough, and I'll call it a day. Now, there are other elements to touch on. I'll have another video up. So let's talk about, briefly, just before I wrap up, the ray tracing elements of both machines. So they both use the, as expected, patented AMD release that came out a few years ago in terms of the BVH, the bounding volume hierarchy. So this is a box, kind of like an octree, a grid, something to minimize the amount of work, to box off vertexes or geometry. The process here is to minimize the amount of time you're accessing memory and therefore calculating what the ray's touching. Now remember, this uses the shader system within the GPU cores itself. So if you're using it to do this work, you're minimizing the amount of work that the shaders can do elsewhere. But also bear in mind, just like RTX, that all this does is accelerate that BVH hierarchy cascade. So it will pass through that, work out what it needs to do. You then need to do something with it. So you then got to pass it back to the shader anyway. Your pixel shader, your geometry shader, your mesh shader, your vertex shader, whatever you're going to use it for to result what it might be. Global illumination, reflections, shadow casting, AO, whatever. So this element is going to be limited by the amount of cores you've got. So the advantage here is the Xbox One Series X has more cores, but the PS5 has faster throughput, i.e. faster clock speed. So it's probably going to be better on the Xbox Series X. How much? By how much? And you know, how that pans out in games, how they're going to use it, that's another exciting element. And this is where my excitement levels are. It's the differences between these two machines that's making me look forward to diving into them in more detail than it is actually the machines themselves and the specs that we're looking at. The 3D spatial audio, the Tempest engine, that really, I think, is centered around VR, is another exciting element which I'll touch on in another video. But for now, I think I've waffled on enough, and hopefully it wasn't too boring. If you enjoyed this or anything else that I've put together, then please help support me by subscribing, sharing and liking, because that really, really helps. Remember, I'm completely self-funded and independent, so I do this as a part-time thing. What you can be sure is, just like this generation when it started, I was out at the ground floor and I was giving you analysis information and everything else, frame rates analysis, console analysis. I'll be doing exactly the same thing many weeks, days and months to come. And leading up to these consoles coming out, I'll keep you afresh on the information and some samples and data as we move into it. And then once they launch, I'll be diving deep into all the hardware, the specs, the performance on both the backwards compatibility games that they'll both offer, and also the forward ones in terms of how different they'll be. There are a lot of things about patch versions and things in terms of releases. That's not really how these things are going to work. I'm pretty sure you're looking at completely different binaries here because of the fact that they're completely different pieces of hardware. It's a very different thing to say you'll support something going backwards or you'll enable people to play games on two formats. But in this digital age, shipping multiple binaries or downloads to actually ship on a complete console, that's actually a completely different subject matter entirely. But it's a time, another video for another day. I'll catch you all on the next one, but be sure to stay close to the channel. Thank you.
Thank you!